Welcome to the Company of Dads podcast, where we explore the sweet, silly, strange, and sublime aspects of being a lead dad in a world where men, who are the go-to parent, aren't always accepted at work, among their friends, or in the community for what they're doing. I'm your host, Paul Sullivan. Our podcast is just one of the many things we produce each week at the Company of Dads. We have various features, including the Lead Dad of the Week. We have our community, both online and in person. We have a great new resource library for all fathers. The one-stop shop to learn about all of this is our newsletter, The Dad. So sign up today at thecompanyofdads.com/thedad. Today, my guest is Brad Harrington, the Executive Director of Boston College's Center for Work and Family at the Carroll School of Management. Brad has had two careers in his life, 20 years at HP in its heyday from 1990 to 2000, and from 2000 to now, running the Boston College Center for Work and Family. What was the trigger for the change? Well, in theory, it might seem like getting his PhD from Boston University in 1999, but in practice, it might really have been commuting between Palo Alto, California, and Geneva, Switzerland, with two children at home and another on the way. Experiences like that, however, have informed some of the groundbreaking research that the center has done on working parents. Welcome, Brad, to the Company of Dads podcast.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Do you ever miss the frequent flyer miles? I mean, Palo Alto to Boston, Boston to Geneva. You must have, had like Excalibur status or something like that.
Yeah. Well, I hate to badmouth United Airlines, but at one point I had, $500,000 or something like that. And then I found out later that at a certain point they canceled your frequent flyer miles.
Oh no.
Yeah. So I don't fly United anymore because they canceled my frequent flyer miles before I really got to tap into them. So
I remember, when United and Continental merged, a lot of the frequent flyers on United, they were up in arms, like what was going to happen to the little ramekin of warm nuts that you got in first class. I only got them once. They're pretty good, but I could understand the outrage.
Yeah.
We're going to focus on your time at the BC Center here. And, you started doing research on working fathers back in 2010, so way before the pandemic changed the way we were thinking about working and living. What prompted starting doing that research back then in 2010?
So I had been in the role here at Boston College since 2000, and one of the things I was struck by is how completely and utterly absent men were from the conversation around work life and work family. We go to conferences, we present to corporate members, we work with researchers from universities all over the world that focus on this issue. And I would say 98 times out of 100, the people who were represented, the people who did the research, the people who were the practitioners, the people who supposedly were taking advantage of all the work, family, and work-life programs were women. And I totally understood that, given the large role that women were playing in the home front, obviously much larger, probably 2 to 3 times as much as most working fathers. But by the same token, it just seemed to me that them being completely absent from the conversation, them being dads, was really problematic. On one front, from an organizational perspective, you said, gee, men have to be part of this conversation because they are the people who are pulling the strings from an organizational perspective of corporate culture. And they're the ones who are sort of, determining what was appropriate behavior and what was appropriate around, working hours and things like that for all employees. And women were going to be the, if you excuse the term, the victims of that one way or the other. And then on the home front, you got the sense that, the role of fathers was just so diminished that, there was this stereotype that fathers did two things, bring home the bacon and wait till your father gets home, the disciplinarian role.
Yeah.
And I really knew from talking to a lot of dads that was just not an accurate depiction. So at that point, we decided, so many organizations, so many researchers are focusing on women, and maybe this is a unique opportunity for me, a man leading a work-life organization, to try to see if the focus could be balanced a bit more.
Yeah, and I mean the crazy thing here is this is 2010, and nobody had been doing research. 2010, that's 13 years ago. This is not 1970, it's not 1980, it's not even 1990. And so when you started your research, what were some of the early findings, and obviously what were the findings that really stood out to you, but also to people who are reading your research?
I think what we studied the first time, Paul, was we looked at the transition to fatherhood. I was working with a doctoral student who's now a professor at Northeastern, Jamie Ladge, and she had done her
who has been on our podcast. She's been on our
right.
podcast. Jamie's wonderful. Yep.
She's wonderful, and she's a very prolific researcher and scholar. She had studied while she was in the doctoral program here at BC how young women professionals go through the transition to motherhood and then how they reassimilate back into the workplace. So, to make a long story short, these women, first-time moms, were focused completely on their career. They then had a child and were focused for 3 or 4 months or whatever time they took off on being a full-time mother. And then they went back into the workplace, and suddenly they had two critical roles that they had to balance. And so what Jamie was trying to look at is, what were the identity issues and struggles that women went through as they went through this transition from professional to full-time mother to professional and mother. Mm-hmm. And what we decided was what we would try to replicate the research that she had done, but do it with fathers and see whether or not the transitions they went through were similar or very different than working moms. And the first thing that really stuck out to you was that at that time, there was nobody who was offering dads paid time off for parental leave, and virtually no fathers were taking time off for parental leave, paid or unpaid. And so right off the bat, there was a very drastic difference between moms and dads, where on average, I'd say dads were taking 2 or 3 days off following the birth of their child, and moms were taking 3, 4, 5 months off. So right from the word go, the roles and the patterns were very well established. And, one of the things that struck me is, given that those roles are established, that even by the time the woman goes back to work, and even if she's working full time, it's going to be very unlikely that those roles are going to be reversed in some way, because, the mother not only had the biological, responsibilities for the child, especially in the early months, but also she had a much better sense of what it was to be a parent and how to respond to your child and what the child's needs were and all that kind of thing. And, men's lack of time spent in that role really led to, lesser feelings of competence and confidence in terms of their parenting skills. So it struck us right off the bat that was going to be a huge indicator of whether or not, men were going to be able to be equal partners in the caregiving process.
Yeah, we talk about equal partners at home, but one of the things we really push at the Company of Dads is to, encourage men to allow men at work to be lead dads, which that's a term we use a lot. It's the go-to parent, whether he works full-time, part-time, devotes all of his time to his family. And the counter to that is an event dad. And any company in America will let you leave for a soccer game, a graduation, whatever. But we always say, like, when men become lead dads, is that good for them? Sure, of course it's good for them. But it's also good for the working moms in the workforce, because suddenly, women are not seen as the only person who's going to have to take on parenting or caregiving responsibilities. And hopefully it starts to change the perception of some of the managers of those people, saying, okay, we don't just have working moms and they get stigmatized. We have working parents. And if we make a few small changes around how we do these things, we can help a whole group of people. When you we're doing the research, you talk about, and the research you and Jamie Ladge have done, you talk about the impact that it had on the home front and establishing patterns. You're there for 5 months, you're going to establish certain patterns. But what was the impact at work? I mean, because your center is funded by a whole bunch of companies that want to learn from the research you're doing. What was the impact at work when you started to allow men to have, or not just allow, but encourage men to take parental leave?
Well, the first step was getting on organizations to understand that that's something that men valued. So in 2013, so this is, I think, our third study, we decided to do a study on men's attitudes around parental leave. And at that time, again, that's 10 years ago, there still was almost no companies that were offering dads any more than a few days or at most a week for parental leave. But there were, little things bubbling up that started to suggest that some organizations were going to do this. And some men had written some pieces that really sort of talked about what an important experience it was for them to go through this. I think initially, the feedback from men was we would love to have leave. We would want to spend time with our children. There was some data out there that suggested that even though dads are doing far less on the home front, that they were experiencing as much or more work-family conflict as their spouse was. And that surprised a lot of people. But fathers felt very kind of conflicted about the fact that they were home less, that they were not entitled to any form of leave. And as a result of that, they, I think, felt more detached from families than they wanted to be. And you asked about, or talked about the fact that, how does this impact women? I mean, it's pretty obvious that in those days, not only did women face a struggle in terms of trying to balance these two important roles, but organizations also had a view, which was the view is, a woman who has a child is going to be less committed, less dedicated. And there was even a piece of research that said that organizations viewed women who had children as not only less committed, but also less competent, believe it or not, in terms of their professional roles. And so you say to yourself, I mean, there's obviously a huge shadow on women's careers as a result of the fact that they were taking leave and they were seen as the people who are going to do the lion's share of the caregiving. So organizations, not rightly so, but wrongly so, I think decided, well, when you're a woman, you're going to have to make compromises. And so therefore you may not have the kind of career opportunities or career trajectory that a man would have. And so these things were not working, well for men or women at that point in time. And when we kind of published that report, organizations were thinking, well, the federal government doesn't seem like they're ever going to do anything on paid parental leave. It just seemed like a non-starter every time it came up. And so I think some of the corporations we work with decided, well, if they're not going to do anything on paid parental leave, we're going to expand the amount of leave that we offer. And I think our report was influential in getting them to say to themselves, maybe we shouldn't just expand it for women, but we really need to make it gender equitable. And so that's what was happening after the 2013 report was published.
Yeah. And when that happened, how did it happen? What was it, a group of companies that announced this? Was it one then the next? Did certain employees say, hey, look, I'm not going to come work for you. I'm working over here and they have, paid leave and you don't? What was the process for that happening?
Well, I mean, our study did surface that, men definitely wanted leave. And one of the questions we asked is, if you were going to have more children, would having parental leave be an influence over the employer you chose? And overwhelmingly, they said, yes, it would have an influence. They also overwhelmingly said, if I'm going to take the leave, I want to get paid for it. So men were more mercenary, if you will, about it. But I think that was a result of the fact that, a lot of their wives were taking leave and being unpaid. And so they couldn't imagine any situation where they would be able to also take unpaid leave. So what happened right after that, members of our roundtable, and it started, I think, with Johnson & Johnson, decided that they were going to expand their paid leave and they were going to offer it for both men and women. And this was probably around 2014. But, those discussions were had as a result of the report we did. And J&J, I think, gave 8 weeks initially, which was seen as a huge step forward for both men and women. So most of the organization we work with will separate what they call bonding leave from birth and recovery. So this was the 8 weeks was in addition to the birth and recovery, and it was for both men and women to take. And then shortly thereafter, I think it was EY was the next one. They said, well, we're going to give 12 weeks. And once that snowball started, all of a sudden we saw, Deloitte do the same, American Express, IBM, Intel, all these companies that we work with, one after another, started to expand their paid leave policy for all parents and made the policies gender equitable. I think one of the organizations that did it relatively early on, I said, geez, this is great. At that time, we were thinking giving it to men is such a rarity, and so I said, how are you able to get that approved with your executives and your executive committee? And the woman said, between you and I, the truth of the matter is they said, yeah, give it to the guys too. They won't take it. And I think that was a common assumption back then that you can offer men leave, but they're not going to take it because they don't want to be, saddled with being seen as, not a player in the workplace. But quickly, that organization and all the others that offered men leave realized that if we offer men leave and we offer to pay them for the leave, the majority of them are going to take advantage of it.
I remember it was last year or more when I talked to Jamie and she said, some of her research, maybe you did it together, but how, pre-pandemic, when doing all this research, when men would raise their hands and want to be, full parents, would want to be lead dads at work, they were seen as insufficiently committed to their job. Now, there's a pile of research saying how women are penalized for having children, but
Yes.
that statement always stuck out to me, because unless you're running in an organization, and your goal is to hire only sociopaths, you would want fathers to have some connection, some desire to be involved with their children, some affection for their wife, so they'd want to be with her, help her out.
Yeah.
And it shifted. I would say it shifted, but we still hear stories at the company of dads of guys who are, being shamed for taking it. I can think of some law firms that we've talked to, where the senior partners almost brag that all the things they missed out on, and the more junior employees, they're struggling. How do you help companies combat some of the detrimental effects of seniority, of confirmation bias, of having gotten a place in a certain way, and to realize that people are living and working in a different way today?
I think it's challenging because, and I don't know the most recent stats on this, but if, a few years ago, if you looked at the Fortune 100, Fortune 500 CEOs and really C-suite executives within organizations, it was overwhelmingly men. I mean, 10 years ago, I think it was 96% of CEOs were men and only 4% were women. That number is now about 10% for women. So there's been some headway. But, and not only were they men, the overwhelming majority of them were married. The overwhelming majority of them had a stay-at-home wife. And they, I remember one study, and this is back, probably more than 10 years, but they said not only did they have a stay-at-home wife, but they had never personally even experienced a daycare problem or a childcare problem. So there wasn't even an instance where they were confronted with making a choice between work and family. So I think when you have those people at the very senior levels, obviously there is a bias there about how they did it and how committed they are, and that kind of thing. And that kind of perpetuates what's called the ideal worker norm, right?
Yeah.
So I think at that point it was seen like, well, women can't be ideal workers because they also are struggling to be ideal parents. And it's impossible to make those two, kind of mythical stereotypes kind of fit together. But I think that, the idea was, but men, if they have a wife, they still must be able to do all the things they need to do in order to, to get the work done, no matter how many hours it takes or how much travel it consumes or whatever. I think that, though, as younger people have come up through the ranks, and organizations do a lot of, as employee engagement surveys and satisfaction surveys and so forth, the message became louder and louder. I think that men and women have, their expectations aren't so drastically different than it once was. And when we look even back in 2013 at the parental leave study, we asked what the priorities were, and we gave them a whole list of like 16 things that they prioritize most. And when we looked at the top 5 items on the list, moms and dads prioritized the same 5 items as being the most important things for them. And it was things around workplace flexibility and time off with, kids and things like that. The rank order of the specific 5 were a little bit different, but generally speaking, the experience of working moms and working dads are more similar today than you might think. Just one example from our most recent study on parental leave, we asked the folks who took the study, we said, if you didn't take the full amount of leave, or if you considered not taking the full amount of leave that the company made available to you, why was that the case? Yeah. And 45% of the men said, I was afraid that if I took the full amount of leave, it would have a negative effect on my career advancement. So that's, significant and it's, it's honest. But the same question, 55% of the women said the same thing. So more women than men said, I was afraid it was going to impact my career advancement. Now, that said, women were much more likely than the men to take absolutely all the leave that was available to them. But I think the fears and the expectations are not that different between women and men these days. And I think eventually the people in more senior roles, had working spouses or were paying attention to their employee surveys, and they realized, the needs of men and women are becoming more similar rather than different, and men want leave and men want flexibility.
Yeah, we spent some time with some really interesting leaders who have had, I would say, success, tremendous success earlier in their careers, and when they became dads, they were, far ahead of the average, person in his late 30s, early 40s. And the ones we've talked to, they've parented, publicly, and they've taken the leave, and it's had a transformative effect on their organizations because, not only are, more moms more comfortable taking the leave, but more dads are comfortable taking the leave because they can see, a model and the importance of modeling there.
Yeah. And I mean, people sometimes will say, like, why is it that in your study such a higher percentage of men took leave than was the case? Like when you see states that have leave policies, a smaller percentage of men typically take the leave than what we found in our study. And we're very clear that the study we did was in 4 major corporations. It wasn't a study that you could apply to anybody in any circumstance. But I'd say there's 2 reasons why there's a difference. The first reason is they know they have organizational endorsement to do it. So these are organizations that have said publicly and in their written, policies, HR policies and so forth, they've said, this is something we champion, we support, and this is a benefit that's accessible to you. And it's more powerful to have your CEO saying that than it is to have, Gavin Newsom saying it if you work in the state of California. That, you know what I mean? That it's nice that Gavin Newsom might say that, but it doesn't necessarily make you feel comfortable that your employer is going to be just as comfortable as others might be. The second reason was that most of the state policies tend to offer a certain percentage of salary up to a cap, right? So they might say, we'd offer 50% of salary or 70% of salary for X number of weeks, but it's up to a cap. And the cap is typically much lower than people in the organizations we studied are used to. And one of the things we knew from talking to men is if I could get 90 or 100% of pay, I'll take it. If I can only get 50 or 60%, I probably won't. So I think those are 2 very powerful motivators. Is one, my boss, my CEO is saying that this is something they endorse and support. And the study we did on parental leave, where we asked dads, did you get a high level of support from management and from senior leadership? The answer was, yes, I did. I got very high levels of support. And then the second is that they got the full pay, which is still a rarity that, the people who work in organizations would get full replacement pay for 8, 12, 16 weeks.
I know from previous conversations that, the cadence of the annual studies has sort of stopped around 2020. You've been doing other work, but you're immersed in this. So anecdotally, when you're talking to companies and, how COVID, how hybrid work, how work from home, how it's changed what they're asking of workers and what workers are willing to provide. What are some of the things that stick out to you among the changes between that employer-employee dynamic post-COVID?
Well, certainly a year or 2 ago, you would have said the biggest change is the fact that employees felt and were, I guess, much more empowered to push their influence about, work, about salary, and about the way they wanted to work. And so you saw that there was a big shift from, organizations that would say, whether this is right or wrong, we demand that you're in the office 5 days a week, and that's the way it's going to be. To now we're in a situation where some employers are having to really cajole and encourage and incent people to come back into work. So I think we're in a situation now where I don't think this pendulum has finished swinging quite yet, but I do think it seems like, especially amongst knowledge workers, you can't say this for people who are in jobs that require manual labor or direct customer interface, or even doctors or plumbers. I mean, they have to show up and be there in order to get their job done. But in the knowledge industries, I think what we find is that we've probably reached a sweet spot, which is most organizations are going to continue to allow or encourage, however you want to put it, people to work 2 to 3 days a week at home and 2 to 3 days a week in the office. They have different ways of doing this. And I think the pendulum has swung more back toward, we want more people back in the office, obviously, since COVID has ended. But I don't think it's going to swing back to what it was. We still are seeing, most employers are saying, well, when they say we want people back in the office, they mean 3 days a week. They don't mean 5 days a week. And I think that, at least in the knowledge worker space and in jobs where people can easily do them remotely, I think, we're finding that that's pretty much where things are landing these days.
When you talk to companies and they are either completely flexible and allow people to work, hybrid, and if they need to come in for a meeting, they come in. And on the other extreme, companies, and these are all knowledge companies that are completely inflexible and they're demanding 5 days a week, even if, employees aren't coming. What's often motivating, I guess leniency on one end, or trust might be a better word, and, strictness and distrust on the other. What motivates that?
Often it's the bias of the CEO and the senior executives. I can think of one, very, very well-known investment bank who said, come hell or high water, you're going to be back here. I guess it was March 2020, and mid-March was around when everybody was sent home pretty much across the board. And, a CEO of one investment bank we know said, March 2021, everybody is back in the office full time, and that's it. He just had, and others in that same industry had a strong bias that that's not our culture to have people working remotely. And I don't know if it was a trust issue, but obviously there was a culture there, not only of show up in the office, but also working long hours was part of the culture. And people in that industry get well rewarded for that. But at the end of the day, they are sort of giving their pound of flesh in order to get the work done and meet the requirements of their bosses. Others, I think, just saw either the logic of saying, gee, we could save a lot of money by not having people necessarily return to office, and maybe we could consolidate our commercial real estate space. I would think that was probably particularly popular in places like Boston, New York, Palo Alto, San Francisco. And, San Francisco is always the one that's pointed to as having the lowest kind of return rate amongst all the major cities when it comes to people back in the office full time. San Francisco has really been not an outlier, but sort of like the one metropolitan area where people say people just aren't coming back to the office, and it's really having a negative knock-on effect on sort of the companies that rely on people being in the city every day. But I think a lot of it really did come down to some combination of the logic and the expense of allowing people to work where and when they thought was best, versus the bias of some senior executives who just felt, either A, this is a show up and work culture, or B, they legitimately believe that creativity was spawned and stimulated much more by face-to-face interactions than it was on Zoom,
I'm smiling because I don't know if we're talking about the same investment bank, but I have a friend who's a managing director at a bank where the CEO has required everybody back in the office 5 days a week. And when he wants to work from home, because he just has calls and stuff to do, he's obviously a very smart guy. He will schedule a Zoom call early in the morning, and instead of being dressed casually like you and I are, he will be in a suit. Like he'll be more dressed up than he would be if he went into the office. I said, why do you do that? He says, I like to strike a little fear into their hearts and make them think that I'm applying for jobs that day. And it's quite clever and it's very funny, but it points to a bigger issue that, some of these firms, many of these firms that have required people you're taking kind of an attendant type approach as opposed to an outcomes approach to the work, have really seen their morale suffer. At what point does that become a factor into how people are going to work going forward? As you said, companies are always polling their workers as to what you want. And if the morale stinks and your senior people are going to other jobs, what does it take for them to say, okay, maybe there's a sweet spot for working and being at home?
Yeah, that's hard for me to know because I don't really get close enough to companies that I have insights about, what are their morale studies telling them? I get a lot of anecdotal evidence. We work a lot with the HR department. We get a lot of anecdotal evidence from those, especially those where they've had a reversal in terms of the work from home thing. Some companies kind of went whole hog and said, we don't see ourselves coming back at all. And so employees took that literally and decided, well, maybe I'll move to a new location that's not as cost prohibitive and so forth. And then a couple, some of those very high visibility companies said, well, hey, wait a minute, we've had
on second thought.
Yeah. And we want you back in here, and if you move 200 miles away, that's not our problem. It's yours, kind of a thing. So I don't know enough about what are the statistics on employee engagement and satisfaction, but anecdotally, you definitely hear from people in the human resource function that people are, when they're forced to go back, they're going back, but they're not happy about it. And, I think that's going to be one of the criteria that people are going to use, especially young people, to look and say, is this the employer I want to stay with? Or if there's a competitor down the road and they're willing to allow me to work remotely, I'm happy to do that. I think, it's not, it's easy to come down on the side of saying people should be allowed to do whatever they want. And maybe because of my age, I worked for 20 years at HP, and I did work remotely the last couple of years. You mentioned I was living in Boston, working in Palo Alto and so forth. And so I did spend, part of my time in Palo Alto and part of my time working out of my home. And so I was on that bandwagon pretty early, but I always recognized for myself that not being in an office and not being able to interact with colleagues on a regular basis was a loss. I mean, I felt the sense of loss from that. We had a panel discussion at a meeting we held the other day where we had 4 young people, and they said, yeah, I understand that. And, a lot of young people find, especially if they've moved to a new location, they find a sense of social connections through going to the office because that's where their new peer group is. Sure. But they were pretty damn happy with hybrid. I can tell you that. And when I asked them about, mentoring or networking or things like that, these young people, they acknowledged it might be a little bit more difficult, but it was clear to me that these were not people who were begging to get back in the office 5 days a week.
Well, you're in Boston right now, and a good friend of mine works at a law firm, Goulston Stores, a big law firm in Boston, very senior guy. And what they did quite early on was they instituted anchoring days. And so you'd have 1 or 2 days a week, pick Monday, Thursday, never going to be Friday, but, Monday, Thursday, whatever. And people on that team, whatever that team was, HR, litigation, they would be in the office and they would have that intentional work. And then when you think about it, if you're a knowledge worker, large portion of what you're doing is sending emails, responding to emails, putting together presentations. Yeah. And that seemed to be, a sweet spot for them. But
that's pretty common. I would just say, Paul, the idea of anchoring days is become pretty common, where certain days, 2 days a week or something like that, everybody is going to be in, so that there are opportunities for a lot of face-to-face meetings and interactions. But what you're saying is absolutely correct,
Yeah. Early on in your research, Brad, you said, you wanted to sort of dispel, sort of 2 of the myths around, what fathers were. There was sort of the Mr. Mom idea of sort of an emasculating version of a man, but also kind of disparaging to women. And then there was the Neanderthal, the bring them the bacon, the bread, whatever. It's something unhealthy that we shouldn't eat that served as a substitute for money. When you think of, the 13 years since you did that first study, and you think of fathers and working fathers, how has that image of them evolved? Is there an emerging archetype or a series of archetypes that is neither Mr. Mom nor the Neanderthal?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, because I think it's the image of dads that really suffered. I don't know if we were ever as much Neanderthals as we were portrayed to be, but if you looked at mass media or television programs or advertisements or things like that, they really tended to paint an image of fathers which was extremely unattractive. When you say Neanderthals, it was like these people wouldn't know which end of a diaper to put on a child, and the only thing they know how to do is bring their kids to fast food restaurants and things like that. And so the image, that was constructed and was common in the media was, dads are just incompetent parents, period. And, we did a study for a consumer goods company, a very, very large and very famous one. And they said, what do you think the images are? Because we're trying to understand. They had a brand and they were really trying to promote kind of today's dad, kind of an image. And they said, what do you think, when people think of these things, what are the images? And it was like, and I hate to bring up, bad news, but it was like, one of the questions we asked is like, name a father, portrayed in television that you think was a good dad, or, and literally the top 2 vote getters were Andy Griffith. Okay. And you and I may be old enough to remember Andy Griffith, but most of your listeners will say, who is that? Right. And the other one was Bill Cosby. Right. Bill Cosby in, what was that, in the 90s or 80s? Dr. Huxtable kind of a thing. And you think to yourself, these are the 2 names that come to mind. I mean, that tells you how, few positive images there were in terms of father as caregiver. And what was interesting, a few years ago when we did a video with one of the big advertising agencies in Boston. And they said that at one time, the stock images that were selected whenever people wanted stock images, Getty stock images, is that
Yeah.
does that, was dad playing football with the kids. That was the number one image. And then in a couple of year period, right around 2015, the number one image was dad holding their child. Right. And so there was something going on then. And I think one of the things that made our fatherhood studies very popular at that time was we sort of caught that wave of when nothing seemed to be, very accurate in terms of depicting dad and caregiver role to something that was much more nuanced. And suddenly you saw athletes and other kinds of role models, the macho man, not being portrayed as insensitive to their childcare needs, but being portrayed as, sensitive, in touch, and caring fathers, which was a great transition that happened over that 13-year period.
Fantastic spot to end. Brad Harrington, Executive Director of the Boston College Center for Work and Family. Thank you for joining me today and sharing your insights.
Thanks, Paul. It was fun.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Company of Dads podcast. I really appreciate you tuning in week after week. Just want to use this moment here to thank the people who make it possible. Number one, of course, Helder Mira, who is our podcast editor. We also have Skip Cherryholmes, who many of you know from the Lead Dad Diaries. He's taken over our social media. Terry Brennan is helping us with our audience development, and Emily Servin is there each and every day helping with the web development. I can't do any of this without an amazing board of advisors. So I just want to say thank you to all of you who help, and I want to say thank you to everyone who listens, and hopefully you'll tune in again next week. Thanks so much.